You also said that Africa now is also gaining more independence from Europe.
Well, has more room for maneuver than over recent decades, and partly this is because European movements have become more aware of how European governments manipulate aid to control African governments. And many European movements, churches and NGOs and so on, are trying to monitor what European governments are doing and trying to insist that this must be for development, for people, and must be according to the needs of these countries. Because a lot of European aid never reaches Africa. It goes to European companies and European consultancies and European providers. It stays in Europe. So the monitoring and exposure of this sort of behavior by European social movements is very important, very important. But something else that is giving us more room for maneuver is that, tactically, is that there are new strong countries emerging in the south. Everybody always talks about China and India, there's also Brazil. And these South-South relations are not simple, are not uncomplex, because we don't want these very big emerging countries to take advantage of the weaknesses of African countries. But we do have now room for maneuver between Europe and these other countries, because now Europe is not the only source of aid, and European companies now have to compete with Indian and Chinese and Brazilian companies for contracts in Africa. And that gives us some leeway. That gives us, if our governments know how to use these rivalries to our advantage and don't simply replace one set of exploiters by another set. But there's a very important difference. Let me point out that when China comes to Africa, they come and they go to a particular government and they offer them aid and they offer them grants and they sign contracts with individual governments. They say, we will build a port for you, or we will build roads, or we will build a stadium. They tender for contracts with African governments. And these terms may be better or worse, depending on the strength of the African governments. But the Chinese, for example, they bring their own technology, their own resources, their own engineers, their own management, and sometimes even their own workers. And they build very fast, and we think very well. Okay, time will tell. But this is very different to what Europe is asking, because Europe says to all African governments, you must open up all your services sectors to any European company, and they must have the right to transfer their profits back to Europe, and they must decide where they will go, how they will operate, and the African governments cannot regulate them. Now that is a very different approach, okay? With the Chinese perhaps, or the Indians or the Brazilians, we have scope to negotiate. As I say, not all African governments negotiate as effectively as they should, but it's still a qualitatively different process than what the EU is now demanding of us.
And how can we as European citizens and activists work to put focus on this negative European investment and aid?
Well, as I've said, the European Union, through the European Commission, is now requiring that all African countries that want to continue to export to Europe and want to receive European aid must sign these economic partnership agreements with Europe. And the European Commission, which is conducting a very big campaign of disinformation, says that it is not linking aid to this trade agreement. But in fact what they say is, we will give aid to you to implement the economic partnership agreements. And these are very problematic, extremely problematic, because Europe is now requiring that for African governments to get access to African countries, to get access to the European market, they must reciprocate. That is, they must give access to European companies. So what I have already described, the impact of big, powerful manufacturing exporters and agricultural exporters from Europe will reinforce the negative effects that we have already had. Okay, but the European Commission is going much further than that, because it is including in these so-called economic partnership agreements other clauses that they call new generation issues, and these are about liberalization of all the services, because services is very important in Europe now. It's more than 70% of the European economy is services. We must open up our service sectors. We must liberalize our investment regimes. We must liberalize our capital transfer regimes. We must agree to competition rules with the European. We must allow European companies to have access to government contracts. Okay, it's called government procurement. All these things have already been discussed for almost 10 years in the WTO. And the developing countries, led by the African countries, rejected and blocked these issues. They're called new issues or Singapore issues in the WTO. So what the European Union is now doing, it is outflanking that resistance, that combined resistance of all the developing countries, and is tackling these countries singly, one by one, or in small groups where they are much weaker, and is trying to impose these terms that have already been rejected. Okay? And they continue to be rejected. Except for very few countries who have agreed to negotiate services or investment, most of the countries in Africa have rejected these new generation issues. And those who have initialed a declaration of intention to negotiate with the Europeans are only dealing with goods. Okay? They say we have this interim economic partnership agreement so that you do not cut off our trade and so that we do not have actions against us in the WTO. And the Europeans are treating these interim agreements as if they are solid legal agreements that are set in stone. And that is not how the African countries see them. They see them as interim arrangements to continue negotiating, to even change some of the terms that have been put on paper, and to continue the processes. They are not committed to full, comprehensive, unconditional agreements with the European Union. And in fact, although the European Union argues to the contrary, out of 47 African countries who could sign such agreements with the Europeans, only 13 have signed bilateral agreements, and another 5 have signed as the East African Community. But many of these are already raising questions about the terms that they are already negotiating with the Europeans. And some, like Namibia, have expressed very strong criticisms, and others like South Africa have refused to sign at all, or Nigeria. Many other African countries, which are least developed countries, have not signed anything at all. And the European Union now is trying to gather the process together and give the impression that much more has actually been achieved than is the case.